level all roads for him. He will rebuild my city and set my exiles free, not for a price or a bribe, says the Lord of hosts.
Great. So that's referring to Cyrus. And Isaiah made that prophecy about 100 years before Cyrus even came to the throne. And so this contingent of exiles had to travel some 800 miles along paths lean and hard. They kept up their guard on the lookout for enemies hostile. Clinging closely to Tigris and Euphrates, they had neither plane nor Mercedes. They walked all the way, each and every day, the men, the women, and the babies. They traveled to the north and to the west, striving and giving it their best, coming to an area of land known as Haran, once the house of the man called Abraham. Next, a 90-degree turn to the left, to a land pillaged and bereft, past Lake Galilee, east of the Great Sea, wondering what they would find next. Traveling south, they found a strange situation, walking right into a half-breed nation. Foreign sounds they did hear, weird sights did appear, to the Jew nothing but degradation. Finally, approaching the city, to a scene not very pretty. Gates broken down, walls on the ground. This had to be a great pity. And Nehemiah tells us this in chapter 1, verse 3.
I really need my lessons to see the verse.
Well, let Diana read it.
Did you find it?
Right there.
Is it the right spot?
Oh, I got it. They said to me, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach. And the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are burned with fire.
Okay, thank you, Bob. The temple was also in ruins, destroyed by Babylonian goons. It had to be restored, but could they afford, and would it be done anytime soon? As you can see, Solomon's temple was magnificent. It was huge. And the Babylonians destroyed this. They burned it to the ground. Take a little while before the Jews returned and rebuilt it. But we'll get to that in a second. To this band, all might have seemed lost. Was the journey really worth the cost? But to allay their fear, God did appear. He'd show them who was the boss. First, the Lord raised up Nehemiah. And his hard work would really inspire. With shovel and pick, mortar and brick, they raised up the walls much higher. Then comes Ezra, the scribe, who unleashed quite a diatribe. No more intermarriages, you see. Better listen to me. The man knew how to create a strong vibe. Next, a man called Zerubbabel, a name really quite hard to spell. The temple he did rebuild, the sanctuary he filled, but evidently not quite as well. Zerubbabel's temple was somewhat inferior to Solomon's. The post-exilic prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, what did they say? Get back to work today. A flying scroll, how odd. And don't you dare rob God. This brings us to the 400 silent years, a period of history filled with intrigue, wars, and tears. When the Jews faced their seemingly worst fears, not a word from God did they hear. The balance of power was shifting from east to west. The Persian armies were no longer the best. Their fighters were losing battles hither and yon, especially to the mighty warrior from Macedon. So this is where Daniel enters the picture, the man who's been a Sunday school fixture. with stories of lions, leopards, and bears, deep and hidden things shown to him in bygone years. Our attention is drawn to Daniel 11, where the prophet has a vision of a message from heaven. The revelation concerns a time yet to come, covering 300 years, and then some. Daniel 11, 1 through 4.
And in the first year of Darius and Meter, I took my stand to support and protect her. Now and then I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will appear in Paris, and then a fourth who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained 20 power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece, and then a mighty king will appear, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. After he has appeared, his empire will be broken up and parcel out towards the 4th winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it give the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others.
Thank you, Jack. Immediately, we see 4 Persian kings, the last confronting a leopard with wings. Darius was powerful and filled with much hate, but he was no match for Alexander the Great. The young Greek hero ruled the Mediterranean world. Dazzling speed and power he unfurled. His minions Hellenism did teach, and to India Alexander did reach. During the young ruler's life, the whole world changed. Even things in tiny Israel were rearranged. The language, customs, culture became Greek. Hellenism was at its peak. But the ambitious young man didn't last long. Guess his wings weren't that strong. He took ill in 323 BC and died at the tender age of 33. Now, Alexander's successors were really oppressors. Called Diadochi, they were military suppressors. They murdered Olympia, Alexander's mother, then Philip, the dead conqueror's half-brother. They broke up his empire and parceled it out. Some going north, some going south. They started much turmoil, bloodshed, and rage, using tiny Israel as their main fighting stage. The Jews clung to their manners, religion, and words. But in a few short years, a new language would be heard. Many of God's people would soon begin to speak the language we all know as Koine Greek. Ptolemy I now reigned in the land of the Nile, extending his influence over Israel for a while. And Seleucus I would rule in Syria. Soon he and his comrades would create great hysteria. And just a quick look at this map. After Alexander's kingdom was parceled out, you had rulers up here, northeast of Israel, which is right here. And you had rulers down here in Egypt known as the Ptolemies. These guys would control the whole area first. And then these guys eventually would take over. And what they would do is the Seleucids and the Ptolemies were always fighting, vying for power, competing against one another. And oftentimes they'd be fighting right here in Israel. And so the Jews bore the brunt of all of this military activity. To Alexandria, over here, multitudes would flock. This Ptolemaic city provided quite a stock. Known for the study of mathematics, astronomy, and poetry, it also possessed the world's largest library. Now, the Ptolemies in the south ruled in Egypt from 305 to 447 BC. And Cleopatra being the last of this dynasty. You remember, she successfully turned the heads of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Ptolemy Soter was the first of the Ptolemaic dynasty. At first, he dealt with the Jews severely, messing with the people God loved so dearly. But his successor treated them more fairly. Now, at this time, something happened that was very new. A project worked on by 72. Something God's people really did need. For Greek was the chief language they could speak and read. Ptolemy Philadelphus authorized the translation of a book that would be a light to the nations. The books of Moses were the first out of the gate, while the rest of the Old Testament was done at a later date. It's known as the Septuagint, or the LXX, the Greek Bible from the Hebrew text. Now, the Greeks could read God's word in their own tongue. The influence of this development was certainly far-flung. But Greek influence did increasingly creep into Jewish traditions that ran very, very deep. It was the Hellenizing party versus the Hasidim, or the pious ones. And let me tell you, folks, this was no fun. You see, the Greek sympathizers wanted to get along, while the traditionalists wanted to remain strong. Both had their good points and bad points, for sure, but none of us would consider either very, very pure. The Hellenizers eventually became the Sadducees, and they wanted lives of power and ease, while the Orthodox ones became the Pharisees, and they maintained a strict adherence to the Bible's A's, B's, and C's. And here's a common scene in Jesus' day, where he is confronted by the Sadducees and the Pharisees and speaking with them and teaching them. Who would you say are the Pharisees in this picture? The Pharisees in this picture, the one in the foreground or the background?
Well, the ones with the robes.
The Pharisees?
Yeah.
What would you say, Tim? Who are the Pharisees?
That guy's got an interesting rod. Who would have a rod and a ring? I'm thinking those are Sadducees.
Yeah, because you know why? The Sadducees are the wealthy ones.
Oh,
They were the ones at the height of power in Israel, whereas the Pharisees were kind of middle class. They were kind of like amongst us. They were the working party. They were the conservative ones. The Sadducees were the ones who wanted to get along with Greece and eventually Rome. Whereas the Pharisees, they didn't want Greek and Roman people butting into their business. Now, there are several philosophies that held sway in that day. For instance, if you preferred a lot of water and barley bread and no social or political matters to mess with your head, then you were called a hedonist. Very different meaning then than it has now. If you wanted to master your emotions and passions and didn't give a darn about the latest pop fashions, you were a stoic. If you wanted to abolish all areas of human desire, talk differently, behave differently, wear different attire, then you were a cynic. If you believed there was no ultimate right and wrong, no arguments that were very strong, you were a skeptic. And finally, if you believed in your inherent immortality and that everything in this life isn't really, well, reality, then you were a Platonist. Let's step out of character for just a sec and ask, where do we find ourselves on life's trek? Are we in danger of assimilation with the culture? Or are we more prone to separation? Something to think about. As we proceed in Daniel chapter 11, we see an escalation of fighting. The bitterness and hatred become biting. Egypt and Syria were at it tooth and nail. No doubt one would win, one would fail. At the Battle of Panion in 198 BC, the Seleucids defeated the Ptolemies. Now Syria would control the Jews. This increasingly became bad news. Israel was allowed to maintain local rule under the high priest, but they would soon be singing the blues. Greek influence would now rear its ugly head. In place of refined literature, we see debauchery instead. For just outside the temple's walls was erected a structure whose games would clearly appall. Gymnastics in the holy city? Why, how clever, how witty. A discus thrower here, a sprinter there, amazing Greek specimens everywhere. But there was only one hitch that made the faithful really twitch. These athletes we would have to exclude. Why? They were performing in the nude. To most Jews, this was more than just sensation. It was an abomination. But this was only the beginning, the top of the first inning. And to add to all this humiliation, we see the Jewish priesthood in disintegration. No longer of Aaronic descent, creating one of Israel's greatest laments. The so-called men of God were rotten to the core, getting in bed with foreigners and playing the whore, treating the temple as their personal playground, disregarding the tension and clamor all around. This paved the way for a most despicable man. He would destroy temples and desecrate the land. Antiochus Epiphanes was his name, and unlike Alexander, he deserves no glory, no fame. He entered Jerusalem as arrogant as could be, wanting to destroy the holy city. Trampling on Jewish faith and tradition, total destruction was his unholy mission. Antiochus is presented in Daniel 11:21 through 35, a dangerous time for any Jew to be alive. He would invade, loot, and violate. Truly one of the most contemptible characters to this day. And the Jews were not the only ones to experience this man so vile. He also attacked the land of the Nile, distributing loot and plunder to his cronies, showing himself to be nothing but a phony. At which point, Egypt received assistance from Rome. And Popilius did something that really hit home. Drawing a circle all around Antiochus on the ground, the madman conceded and probably uttered, "Shalom." Popilius said, "If you step out of this circle, we're going to kill you." And so Antiochus conceded and said, "Okay, Rome, you can have your way." He was humiliated. Frustrated and depleted, the madman retreated to his home base in Syria. But on his way there, he stopped at the land so fair, and against Israel unleashed his awful dysteria. Delaria. I meant to say delaria, but dysteria, not bad. The year was 168 BC, a bad year in the annals of history. The temple was plundered and desecrated, and Epiphanes' hatred was now being demonstrated. His henchmen Jerusalem did destroy. Against the city, an army he deployed. Men lost their wives, their homes, and their lives, the children, the girls, and the boys. The temple was now under attack. And for Epiphanes, there was no turning back. He stole, he looted, he even executed the Marys, the Joes, and the Jacks. New laws were now substituted or instituted throughout the land, while the old ones were buried in the sand. Worshipping Zeus, offending the Jews, even sacrificing pigs on the altar stand. Even Jesus spoke about this event, something that will happen, but also in days spent. Nation will rise against nation, and in the holy place will be the abomination that causes desolation. To this day, Jews might well sing this ditty in remembrance of Antiochus. Hang down your head, Epiphanes, hang down your head and cry. You're nothing but a dirtbag. Someday you're gonna fry. Well, maybe. And at this point, many Jews had quite enough. They needed a person who had the right stuff. Where in the land would there be such a man who was true, courageous, and tough? In Daniel 11:32 through 35, we read of such resistance. Anybody get that real quick? Daniel 11:32 through 35. Tim.
By smooth words, who will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Yet they will fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time.
Good, thank you. So we see here the Jews resisting Antiochus. For some Jews would remain faithful with incredible persistence. They will be burned, plundered, and sawn asunder, but in the end, honored for their uncompromising insistence. And so arose a family from the village of Modin, where remains of ancient burial tombs can still be seen. But on this stretch of sod, a faithful family did trod. They became known as the Hammer of God, perhaps better known to us as the Maccabees, a family of priestly descent, you see. They had neither grenade nor gun, Mattathias and sons. They would simply strike and then hide amidst the trees. Mattathias and company were being forced to conform to heathen rites. But to the old man and sons, this was simply out of sight. A renegade Jew Matty slew, and so began the Syrian Maccabean fight. You may ask, how do we know about these things? So into the discussion we bring a history book, if you please. It's called First Maccabees. Not canonical, but profitable for all of us to read. Back to the action. Mattathias passed on, and his son Judas carried on, leading the guerrilla warfare against the intruders. His objective? Rout and eventually kick out the Syrians from Galilee, Samaria, and Judah. Just 4 years after Antiochus' horror show, Judas Maccabeus became quite a hero, liberating Jerusalem in 164 BC and restoring the temple order known formerly, and the Jews celebrate this right now, this time of year. It's known as Hanukkah. But a bit later, Antiochus' son Eupator attacked with a huge force of elephants and cavalry. And the ragtag Maccabeans were no match, as this time the Syrians gained the victory. Peace terms were surprisingly favorable for the vanquished, not leaving them humiliated and anguished. In Jerusalem, liberty of worship was okayed, and the religious community lived to see another day. But with religious freedom, the Maccabees were not content. Political freedom was also their intent. Judas's brothers, Jonathan and Simon, started the struggle anew. Syria granted them political independence in BC 142. But problems were brewing in Israel also. Divisions and factions were more than a few. The Jewish people just could not agree on what their Bible said or on their foreign policy. we see a ceremony versus grassroots tension. And it's the Sadducees and the Pharisees who grab our attention. The temple Sadducees rule at the upper crust of society, while the synagogue-leading Pharisees are renowned for their teaching and their piety. We could see this in Matthew chapter 16, verse 1. We won't go to it now. Both are prominent in Jesus' day. By the first century, the two groups had lost their way. Arguing and fighting is all that we see, only joining forces to put Christ on a tree. And then there was the Sanhedrin, a group of 71. First dominated by Sadducees and later Pharisees, there were some. Exerting supreme executive, legislative, and judicial power over every Jewish home. Of course, all within limits imposed by imperial Rome. Next, we remember a group called the scribes, fastidiously keeping the past alive, meticulously transcribing the things they wrote, recording documents, letters, and notes. From a distance, we see the Essenes. They wanted to get away from it all, you know what I mean? Living on mountaintops and caves in the ground. This way, from Jerusalem and Rome, they wouldn't hear a sound. The Herodians represent the flip side. The healthy and prosperous Rome was their joy and pride. They compromised to a Roman way of life. After all, why put up with all this religious rules and strife? And then the publicans, the ancient IRS, they put the Jewish people under a lot of duress. Rome didn't want the negative publicity, so it chose local dregs to collect the taxes. It was really duplicity. Finally, the Jewish nationalists were called zealots. They hated Rome a whole lot. Considered the terrorists of their day. They would resort to any measures to drive the Romans away. As far as leadership goes, in 143 BC, Simon Maccabeus was running the show. Peace reigned, the cities were rebuilt, and the general economy restored. Folks in Israel were so pleased, they wanted to give him more. And so in 141 BC, Simon was made political ruler and priest. The concentration of power concerned the General Assembly not in the least. But joy would soon turn into mourning when Simon and two of his sons were assassinated at a feast. With the last of Mattathias' sons now gone, who would carry on? John Hyrcanus, son of Simon, stepped to the plate, a move that would seal Israel's fate. John renewed friendship with Rome while getting involved in the Sadducees-Pharisees conflict at home. He forced conquered peoples to become circumcised. Proselytizing by coercion is never wise. Hyrcanus quickly lost influence with the Jews. And when he died in 107 BC, it hardly made the evening news. He was succeeded by Aristobulus, who murdered his mother, and then slew or imprisoned all his brothers. His son Alexander Jannaeus was even worse. It's almost as if Israel were under a curse. A Sadducee, Alexander ticked off the Pharisees with his sacrilegious acts, creating rebellion, insurrection, and riotous attacks. No matter how hard the Pharisees tried, over 50,000 people died. Alexander, like the heathen, did the most barbarous things, crucifying and mutilating vast numbers of men, women, and even their offspring. Unfortunately, this monster reigned for 27 years, causing much bloodshed and tears. Alexander circumcised conquered foes. How many more enemies did this create for the Jews? Only God knows. Now, some extra biblical writings were important during this time. A few were fanciful, while others contained history sublime. First Maccabees is regarded by historians as a source of accurate information, telling us about the intertestamental struggle of the Jewish nation. Others could be read, but not really a must. For instance, the story of Susanna is about judicial lust. The letter of Jeremiah is a short tract against idolatry, while the book of Judith is about a woman who saves her city from the enemy. Collectively, these and 11 other books comprise the Apocrypha, never to be confused with the Pseudepigrapha, of course, a collection of about 60 more books, giving us cultural insights and looks. Finally, we come to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Writings which are now over 2,200 years old, including portions of the Bible and the separatist life, how they wanted to escape the turmoil and the strife. Back at the ranch, it was Janneus's wife, Alexandra Salome, who provided the necessary stanch, befriending the Pharisees, Israel's conservative group, and they became a major ingredient in the country's political soup. Unfortunately, the queen took ill and died, and her son Aristobulus to the throne applied. More political haggling would follow, creating a Jewish leadership very hollow. Let's step back for a moment of reflection and try to see where all of this is going, what direction. For Israel is being slammed about left and right. And where is her Redeemer, the God of all might? First, she's overrun by the Hellenists of Greece. Then the Ptolemies provide absolutely no peace. Then the Seleucids treat her with utter contempt, leaving Judah completely disheveled and unkempt. Perhaps the Jewish people can turn to the west. Certainly the city of 7 hills will turn out the best. She's ambitious, beautiful, wields plenty of muscle. Then again, it may turn out to be just another frustrating hustle. Maybe God has been present in all of this. It's just that his people have forgotten Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. They've forgotten that. We forget it sometimes. But patience. God is about to end life's greatest mystery with the most spectacular revelation in history. Last we looked, Aristobulus was king and brother Hyrcanus was priest. And this could have worked out well for a few years at least. But selfish ambition and evil machinations were always at work. The question is, who would be the next jerk? His name was Antipater, from a long line of Jewish haters. He was a descendant of Esau and Edomite. You remember the Edomites, the Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, Amorites, the mosquito. No, you know all of these. To many Jews, this just could not be right. This same Antipater, father of Herod the Great, forced Aristobulus inside Jerusalem's gates, laying siege to the city for months on end with the aid of an army of 50,000 men. The stalemate was broken in an unexpected way. Pompey, the famed Roman general, would now enter the fray. Both sides bribed him, begging for help. Guess Aristobulus let out the most convincing yelp. Not so fast. This wasn't over by a long shot. Antipater said, "Let me go to Pompey and show him what I got." The general graciously heard the Edomite contender. Aristobulus? Poisonous drink proved to be his ender. As for Jerusalem, battering rams demolished its towers. Could well see why it would. Those suckers are big. Ah, yes, these people from the West knew how to wield power. Almost 12,000 people were killed this day, Roman soldiers cutting down priests along the way. And so the nation who knew not true repentance would now lose its independence. Judea was now under the Roman yoke. Better would it have been to depend alone on the Lord of hosts. But all was not lost, as we will quickly see. There was much more than just the Roman military. So what else did Rome bring to the table? Well, for one thing, an empire that was relatively stable. Now, Pax Romana, Roman peace, would dominate the Mediterranean region. Of course, it was all enforced by Roman legions. But these Westerners are known for a number of remarkable feats, actually giving the world some incredible treats. For instance, the Romans built aqueducts on an unprecedented scale, supplying water to cities' fountains, latrines, public baths, and homes almost without fail. Also, arched structures made bridges stronger, allowing them to last much, much longer. Especially gifted were the subterranean engineers, building tunnels that have lasted over 2,000 years. Perhaps Rome's greatest accomplishment was its road network of 74,000 miles, extending from northern England to the southern Nile, way up here, all the way down here someplace. They did an incredible job. This highway system made travel easier for all, especially for people like Jesus, Timothy, and Paul. It's in this atmosphere that we are introduced to Herod the Great, a man most Jewish people really did hate. The sobriquet Great owing to his magnificent building projects. Unfortunately, he treated his family and subjects like objects. Herod is responsible for changing the rule of Judea from the Hasmoneans to the Herodians. He was appointed by Caesar Augustus as Judah's political custodian. As a murderous, vindictive tyrant, Herod was not alone. He executed anyone who even posed the slightest threat to his throne. Some were strangled, others were drowned, some by the sword were viciously cut down. Could have been a wife, a son, or a priest. And then Herod would be filled with fearful remorse over the deceased. Yeah. And so we cannot be surprised by Matthew's report in chapter 2, verse 16. This maniac ordered all male children under the age of 2 to be wiped from the scene, bringing us more or less to the end of the era known as the 400 years of silence, a period characterized by cruelty, warfare, and violence. How do we make sense of it all? Perhaps it's best summarized by Paul. Now I quote Galatians 4, 4 and 5. But when the time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under law, to redeem those under law, that we might receive the full rights of sons. You see, Jesus came when God's purpose was ripe. All of our expectations, workings, and plottings mere tripe. And he didn't come to Herod, to the Sadducees, or to Pilate down the block. Rather, he came to poor shepherds looking after their flocks. You might ask, why did God wait so long? Maybe against sin we just aren't that strong, or perhaps Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato are brilliant in our own eyes until we come to the conclusion that only God is wise. In the fullness of time, God sent his Son as a solution to sin. He's the only one, because sin is the one thing man could never master. All of our processes, methods, and devices have turned into a disaster. Born of a woman and sinless at birth, regarding the law, not even a smirch. The purpose of God to buy us back, to adopt us into his family, the Tims, the Sarahs, and yes, the Jacks. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for the fact that you can come into our messy, filthy, sinful situation here in this world, and you can provide solace and comfort and peace and solutions, eternal solutions, not just temporary ones, but eternal solutions to the problems we have, especially to the deepest problems, the deepest issues that we are confronted with concerning our own sin and the consequences of our sin. Only you, through Jesus Christ, can provide the kind of salvation that is necessary. We thank you that at this time of season, we can begin to really dwell on these things, to see how powerfully you work. You work through history. You work through kings and queens and priests and politicians, but you also work in our individual lives. And you come to save us and to redeem us and to give us the kind of life that you always wanted for us. So we thank you. We thank you. We praise you. In Christ's precious name. Amen. Any questions?